Brazil is the most successful football country of all time. They have the most World Cups of any nation and constantly produce amazingly talented players, many of whom end up as Ballon d'Or winners. Football is the universal language of the world, but if there's one nation that can say football is literally their culture, it's Brazil. However, despite this elite status, Brazil seems to have a clear handicap compared to other top countries. They cannot develop any competent managers. Don't believe me? Then think about the last time you saw a Brazilian manage a club in a top 5 league. Well, I'm not gonna lie, there have obviously been some examples, but if you think about the last 5 years, or the last time any Brazilian coach was actually successful in a big European club, I'm sure you won't find any. But why is that the case? Why, despite having such a rich football culture, is Brazil stuck with incompetent managers? In this video, I'll show you all the surprising reasons why this has happened in the past couple of decades, the impact it has had on Brazilian football, and in the end, I'll even give my own take on what Brazil can do to change this precarious situation once and for all. But first, let me give you some context. Despite what we see nowadays, Brazilian coaches have played a big role in revolutionizing football as a whole. So let me take you all the way back to the 1940s and meet Flávio Costa. A Flamengo defensive midfielder in his playing days, Flávio was heavily influenced by the then popular WM formation. When he became a manager, he created what he called the diagonal system. Contrary to the rigid WM, his system introduced a more fluid attacking structure that allowed Brazilian players to shine thanks to their offensive prowess. Ultimately, Flávio Costa didn't go down in history as a trailblazer because his name will always be associated with the Maracanazo, Brazil's wasted first shot at World Cup glory on home soil no less. The name might have perished in shame, but his incomplete work served as an inspiration to Zezé Moreira, who emphasized defensive solidity in Flávio's diagonal system, creating a sort of precursor to the now common back four. Finally, in 1958, Vicente Feola popularized the 4-2-4 formation thanks to Brazil's iconic victory in the 1958 World Cup. He emphasized having two midfielders capable of linking defense and attack, which provided balance. The fullbacks were also introduced to support the attack, which was a novel idea at the time. Though Feola's 4-2-4 wasn't a completely new idea, his formation was the first to be widely used and successful. One of his most valuable players was Mario Zagallo, who was primarily the team's left winger. As a consequence, Zagallo had the unique privilege of playing as Feola's trademark left winger, adding defensive capabilities to the left wing position and essentially creating a hybrid role between winger and midfielder. Perhaps it was that mandatory tactical awareness that inspired them to become one of the great managerial minds in history, but initially, he simply built on Feola's work. He prioritized creativity and positional freedom while always keeping the team defensively sharp. And just like Zezé Moreira, who was a precursor to the idea of the traditional back four, Zagallo's tactics were basically the genesis of the revered total football. But unlike the managers I've mentioned, Zagallo continued to evolve. Over time, football shifted into a more defensive game, and playing the 60s and 70s Joga Bonito yielded less and less return for the defensive damage it consistently allowed. So, Zagallo, as Carlo Alberto Parreira's assistant, helped put the aesthetics aside and focused on keeping Brazil as defensively solid as possible, launching devastating counterattacks as their main strategy. It wasn't pretty. Many Brazilians dislike that campaign to this day, but hey, they won the World Cup. However, that was almost 31 years ago. And being completely honest, I don't think I can name another manager with the same impact. Sure, Scolari won a World Cup and revolutionized the Portuguese national team, but I believe his impact was far more psychological than tactical. I mean, in his only chance coaching a big club abroad, Scolari couldn't even keep his position until the end of the season. Whether you want to admit it or not, Brazilian coaches stopped in time. That confidence from becoming 5-time champions turned into arrogance, and over time, they developed a mentality that since they were so successful, they should be the teachers by default. There was no need to adapt or change. After all, nobody had achieved more than them. But not all Brazilian coaches act that way. Some actually try to improve and look for more modern training methods. Sure, but they quickly realize that those efforts are all in vain. The Brasileirão is one of the most chaotic leagues in the world. I've talked about it before. One day you're fighting to win a title, the next you're relegated. Forget about the importance of a team's form. That shit fluctuates more than my girlfriend's mood days before a period. Still, thanks to the legacy of the country's state championships, the Big 12 accustomed their respective fanbase to repeated triumphs. Obviously, in a 20-club league, there's no way all clubs can be successful at the same time. But since the torcidas have so much influence in the clubs, the boards usually fire coaches at the slightest misstep. As a consequence, Brazilian managers have developed a survival mentality, focusing on building a solid defense and relying on long balls and crosses as their main strategy to score. What ends up happening is that the managers who eventually build a reputation for being somewhat competent end up being fired by a club and not long after employed by another. This means that they're receiving 2 or sometimes 3 salaries at the same time. There's a small circle of reputable coaches, and if you pay close attention, they're always the ones getting the top jobs in the league. Now you tell me, what motivation would they have to improve if, no matter how average they were, they still got paid more than many aspiring managers in Europe? Yeah, you thought Brazilian managers were paid proportionally to their value? Hell no! Just as an example, Renato Gaúcho was the second highest paid coach last year, racking up a grand total of 2.8 million euros a year, only to finish 3 points above relegation. Just to put it into perspective, that's more than what Nuno Espírito Santo is being paid by Nottingham Forest despite his remarkable campaign. Even the average salary in Brazil would make them among the wealthiest managers in a country like Portugal, for example. So when they do leave, Brazilian managers often move to Middle Eastern countries willing to pay the same or more than what they earn in the comfort of their own country. Then there's the money barrier. Becoming a coach in Brazil is incredibly expensive. And even if you're rich enough to invest in such a risky career, the education you receive is handed out by morons who have done nothing to prove their worth internationally. The current state of football management in Brazil has reached a boiling point. The seleção is at an all-time low, divided between adapting to the European style of football or keeping their core philosophies intact. If you look at Brazilian clubs, more and more are now willing to give chances to foreigners following the groundbreaking success of Jorge Jesus, Abel Freire and more recently Arthur Jorge. Now, with that in mind, I'm not saying Portuguese coaches are destined to replace the Brazilian ones, because there have also been several cases of Portuguese failures in that country. But to sum it up, the world has realized that it's simply not worth investing in Brazilian managers. And now, Brazil has started to realize the same thing. Being average won't be enough in just a few years, so in my eyes, Brazilian coaches need to adapt. The most logical and practical move would be relocating to Portugal. Football is commonly studied in universities, and there are several entities allowing regular bozos like you and me to get a license to coach at the youth level, then work their way up from there. Plus, when you're in the football business, one of the most important aspects is networking. Aspiring managers need to have the humility to be part of a team that they don't lead, learn from those above them, and slowly mature until they can become head coaches. If there's one thing I like about Portuguese football, is that we don't have a locked group of managers hogging all the top flight jobs. Well, at least not anymore. Rui Borges went from managing an amateur side to coaching the current Portuguese champions in 6 years. Daniel Souza worked 10 years alongside Vilas Boas and is now managing Vitória, a team that's still alive and kicking in Europe. My point is that Brazilians could use Portugal as a way to learn from European football without dealing with a culture shock or a big language barrier. Ultimately, it's clear that Brazil has played a huge role in the evolution of football, but over time, they lost that ambitious mentality that got them so far ahead of the rest, and now other nations are starting to catch up. A league system where mediocrity is glorified and incentivized thanks to a focus on short-term goals, coupled with a lack of direction in terms of football culture, is keeping Brazilian football at a standstill. Now, I want to hear what you think, especially if you're Brazilian. How can Brazil start producing world-class coaches once again? And do you disagree with any of my points? Feel free to vent your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to like this video if you want to watch me cover more topics about Brazilian football in the future. Thanks for watching till the end, I appreciate your support, and I will see you in the comments.